Hi. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Dr. Nelson, and I am the Program Director for the Master of Social Work program. Today, we are going to be reviewing skills for professional social work practice. This video is presented from Alabama State University's Department of Social Work. The objectives of this presentation are to learn about professional communication, dress, attendance, and punctuality. Upon completion of this presentation, students will understand the basics and importance of effective communication, including verbal, nonverbal, and written communication skills via email messages, documentation, official agency reports, text messages, etc. They will also understand the use and importance of body language and voice tone in effective communication. Students will understand the importance of attendance and punctuality in the workplace and practicum setting, and understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate professional attire, including grooming practices and habits that are a part of a professional presence and the role of accessories in maintaining a professional appearance. We are going to get started by talking about 3 different forms of personal or at times personal communication. Professional communication can be summarized into 3 categories: verbal, nonverbal, and written. We will discuss each types of communication today and discuss how it can be enhanced to increase our professional communication skills. Let's start with verbal communication. Verbal communication deals with sounds, words, language, and speech. Another important aspect of verbal communication is that it is two-way. We are both sending and receiving information simultaneously when we are communicating verbally. There are several different types of verbal communication that you will use at your practicum or workplace setting. The first one is interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication occurs when there is a conversation between 2 people. One of those people is acting as the sender at any given time, and one is the receiver. That means one person is talking and one person is listening. And they swap roles. So you look for cues when you're switching roles that it becomes your turn to talk and when it is your turn to listen. The next type is small group communication. This happens when there's more than 2 people involved, but a setting like this is still small enough for everyone to act as both a listener, receiver, and a sender of messages. An example would be a classroom setting where the teacher might be up talking. However, the class is responsible for also responding to questions that the teacher might pose. We have small group communication in our professional workplace via meetings, via trainings. And so because there can be multiple senders, and what I mean by that is multiple people can talk because everyone is close enough that you're able to, we often will establish rules of engagement. And those rules of engagement might be, informal ways of knowing who is the person who's supposed to be talking right now, when you're allowed to speak, when you're in a small group, as well as what is the appropriate way to communicate to make sure that everyone is able to really receive the message that the talker is providing. Now, the last one is public communication. And public communication is when you have one sender, one person doing the talking, and several people that are receiving. This is an example of public communication where I'm speaking, but the people that are listening are not able to communicate to the dialogue. It's still a form of verbal communication, though. Now, there's one more type of verbal communication that we don't often think of, and that is our intrapersonal communication. These are the silent conversations that we have with ourselves. And when we are a part of any of the other types of communication, interpersonal, small group, or public communication, we can choose whether we share that dialogue that's happening in our head with others, or if we keep it to ourselves. But what we find is that intrapersonal communication, while in our heads is verbal, it also is conveyed non-verbally to a receiver, so the person who is listening to us. So even though we don't always say what's on our mind, sometimes it can come across in our facial expression. So let's talk about some ways that we can improve or maintain professional communication verbally. First thing is simplify and stay on message. So if you are having a conversation with somebody or if you are in a group meeting, remember what the purpose of that conversation is, as well as what the purpose of the meeting is, and stay on task. So let's say that you really want to address something with your supervisor, but right now your supervisor is talking to you about client X. Finish the conversation about client X and then move on to the topic that you wanted to address with your supervisor. This can help people make sense of where conversations are heading, and it helps them to feel heard. The second thing is engage your listeners. We'll talk about nonverbal ways that you can do that, but speaking clearly, maintaining eye contact, conveying things in a way that are of importance to people. So make them feel like this information is relevant to them. Make them feel like they need to hear it. Not just saying to you, oh, I have to tell you this, but hey, this is why I'm telling you. So giving people a justification of why it's important to hear what you're telling them. Take your time to respond. So remember, in verbal communication, you are a receiver and a sender. And in order to be a sender, you have to receive information, process it internally, and then be able to respond. That processing, the part where you're doing the intrapersonal communication, is such an important part of verbal communication. If you eliminate that part, what happens is we tend to miscommunicate. So take your time to make sure that you're understood. And an important part of that would be also developing your listening skills. So not only being able to speak clearly to people and convey your message, but also being able to interpret their message. Because if you aren't able to listen and properly interpret the message, then we end up with a lot of miscommunication. The next couple things are things that kind of overlap between verbal and nonverbal communication. The first one is respect your audience. This is related both to how you verbally communicate. For example, you would want to speak in a language that is appropriate for your audience. If you're speaking with a 5-year-old, you're not going to use the same type of language that you would speaking with your supervisor. You also will not be speaking with your supervisor in the same way that you would speak with your friends in personal life. Your language is going to be different. The types of words and slang that you use is going to be different. So a part of respecting your audience and having professional communication is making sure that you are tailoring the message that you send to your audience. The second thing is body language is super important. So how we sit, how we face someone, if we are sitting up or slouching, it really does convey to a person whether or not we're receiving their messages, so listening to them, and if the messages that we're sending are important to us, if we feel like it's deserving of them listening to. So let's talk a little bit more about nonverbal communication and think about ways that we can tailor it. So when it comes to personal communication or professional communication, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So many things are impacting the way that our messages are received from other people, and the way that we are receiving other people's messages has a lot to do with how they say it. So when we do that intrapersonal communication and start processing what was said, sometimes we can think, well, that was said with an attitude, and then we respond with an attitude. So it's not just you, it's not just what you say, but it's also how you interpret what other people say. So our facial expressions are really guided by intrapersonal communication, as I said earlier, the thoughts that we're having in our head. Let's take a look at the image on the screen of the woman who is wearing the glasses. What does her face convey? If I'm looking at it, I think that she's intrigued. She's actively, processing what is being said by the gentleman with the tie. But simultaneously, I think she looks a little confused. And so that would indicate, if he was looking at her, that maybe he's not explaining himself clearly. And he might then feel the need to continue explaining. This is where sometimes miscommunications can happen, right? So instead, he could maybe stop and pause and say, is what I'm saying coming across clearly? React to the person's nonverbal cues, right? The second thing that we've already discussed is body language and posture. So leaning into somebody versus sitting back displays active listening. Making eye contact with them displays active listening. Not fiddling with things in your hands or, being on your phone. So this kind of conveys listening, but it's also gestures, right? So pointing at things to indicate, using your hands when I'm referencing, processing in the mind, and I use my hands to convey things. Space, how far you're sitting away from somebody, or alternatively, how closely you are to them, right? Where are you? Are you standing by their side, which makes it impossible to maintain eye contact? Or are you all facing each other? These are all parts of personal communication that impact how people perceive us. So if we are not being conscious of where we are when we're communicating, then we can end up coming off as aloof, as uncaring, as not invested in what the person is saying, and they might then deem us as unprofessional. And finally, voice, including your tone, volume, and pitch, are extremely important to nonverbal communication. So there's a tie between what we do in our behavior and what we're actually saying. So let's provide this example. Your supervisor says to you, "Can you get it to me before the end of the day?" And because the inflection is at the end of the day, it's a question. Now let's alternatively say your supervisor says to you, "Can you get it to me before the end of the day?" And now end of the day is flat at the end of it. Now it gives an indication that they're annoyed, perturbed, and it's less of a question and more of a demand, right? Be careful how you are communicating to people. Even if you didn't mean for it to come across that way, how we use our voice is important. And I like to think of this as code switching, right? The way that we talk to our children, the way that we talk to our parents, and the way that we talk in a professional domain, the way we talk with our friends, all should be different. Our tone should change. That's not a bad thing. We should be code switching and learning how to use our voice in different ways in different types of settings. How I speak with my friends is very different than how I speak to students or in professional environments. And there's nothing wrong with making that change. So there are other ways that we communicate non-verbally, not just during a conversation, but our personal behavior across time is a form of nonverbal communication. Things like showing up on time, showing up consistently, so having good attendance, says a lot to people about how we feel or what we think about anything, about our placement, about our professional environment. So imagine that student who comes to class consistently 5 minutes late. What do you think that communicates to the professor? It communicates that they don't have a high regard or respect for the time. It communicates that the class may be not important to them. That might not even be the case, right? Maybe the student is just consistently getting stuck in traffic. But like it or not, it is a nonverbal way of communicating. And so if you don't follow up nonverbal communication with a verbal explanation, then you are opening the door for miscommunication. Okay. So if you consistently show up late, don't address it with your practicum supervisor, they are then going to internalize that action, your behavior, your nonverbal communication, that you do not care about your practicum. And maybe you're thinking, well, internal dialogue, your internal communication is that, well, I ran into traffic and I'm already frustrated and I really don't feel like going and explaining to this person. But you have to understand that at the same time, you are communicating with them. Even when we remain silent on issues like that, we are communicating. The next thing is preparation. How different is it, or what does it convey or communicate when somebody shows up to a meeting with their pen in hand, a notebook, ready to take notes? It shows that they have thought about the environment, that they are prepared to be an active participant in this dialogue that's about to take place, right? And so these nonverbal cues, alternatively, when someone shows up unprepared, they have not read the thing that they were supposed to read for the meeting, they have not completed their report, it automatically sets a tone for the entire communication, for the entire professional interaction. We're going to go into this a little bit more in just a moment, but the final thing is professional attire and personal grooming. They are big communicators to people about who we are, and they send messages. They convey an idea of self-care for ourselves, but also that we are caring about the professional environment as a whole, and that we understand that we contribute to that entire environment. So again, sending and receiving messages is important, right? When you think about professional settings, how might your clients feel if they walk into an office and there are, it's hot in there and the seats are dirty? They kind of act accordingly. They think, you walk into somebody's home and they've got trash on the floor. You think, well, I'll throw trash on the floor too, right? Same thing with our personal attire. If you walk into a space and somebody has not shown self-care, right? They're wrinkled, they're not prepared, then you automatically think, well, then I don't really need to, act accordingly, right? So there's some good sides to this and there's some downsides to this. Let's talk a little bit more about professional attire and personal grooming and really connect why it is a form of nonverbal communication. So the first thing is you got to identify the office culture for attire. There might be a jeans day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that jeans with holes in the knees are acceptable. Now, maybe it is, but you need to understand so that you don't accidentally show up thinking that, well, jeans are jeans, right? And understand that there are differences. What about jean shorts, right? So knowing what is the appropriate attire for this office, what is the culture of this office, and maybe even asking those types of questions to get a better understanding of what is expected. Whether we like it or not, what we put on our body sends messages to people about who we are. I always like to bring up this example in class about wearing a wedding ring. If I wear a wedding ring and my clients see that, what assumptions do they make about me? Well, they assume I'm married, right? Who do they assume I'm married to? These things are processing in their minds. They might assume that maybe because my nails are painted or I'm wearing earrings that I identify with a feminine the gender norms and that I'm married to a male, right? Alternatively, when people show up and I'm not wearing a wedding ring, what assumptions do they make? They assume I'm single. They might assume that I don't want to be married, right? They might assume, well, she's single, so how could she possibly understand what I'm going through with my partner or significant other? So I say that to say that none of this is really something that has anything to do with what type of social worker we are. But at the end of the day, our clients look at us. They pay attention to those little things. And whether we like it or not, that is who they then interpret those messages that we unconsciously are sending or not even intending to send, but we are sending them. So we have to be conscious sometimes to a certain degree about what we put on our bodies, Now, we don't need to let go of our personal self in its entirety. That's not what needs to happen. But we do need to find a balance between our personal self and our professional self. And this to me goes back to code switching, right? So the idea that what I wear when I'm with my friends is not going to be the same thing that I wear when I am in a professional setting. However, my sense of style will probably be maintained throughout. That would be consistent with, oh, that's, the type of attire that Dr. Nelson wears. For instance, my glasses don't change, right? So if I had red glasses with big kind of spikes coming out of the side of them, they would still be the same. And I could maintain that professional attire and a sense of style by how my glasses look. And it wouldn't take away from my professionalism, but it would allow me to continue to express who my personal self is. So let's take a look at the different domains of business attire. So the first thing we want to do is wear professional clothing. Again, that can vary by agency. We need to ensure that no matter what, our clothing is clean, pressed, and well fitted. Everybody has different body styles. So we have to make sure that the fit is appropriate for our personal body style. Across the board, there are certain professional domains that are consistent. Typically, we do not wear short shorts or things that are extremely revealing of specific body parts, backs, boobs, legs, etc. Right? So when we talk about well fitted, we mean that those things are covered appropriately, right? Wearing appropriate shoes that are clean and safe for the environment is also an important consideration. Choosing accessories that complement your clothing rather than distract it. Again, personal style can be incorporated and should be incorporated into your professional attire. That's why I've deemed this personal communication and not just professional communication. But it should not distract from it. And then removing facial and body piercings. It is pretty standard that ear piercings are acceptable in our culture, okay? We live in America and practicing here, that's completely acceptable. Now, if you decide to go practice internationally, you have to look at what the norms are for that specific area. Alternatively, body piercings and facial piercings are not acceptable for this particular area in most of the types of practice that we're going to be doing. So that also transfers over to things like extremely long eyelashes or certain types of makeup styles that may be considered more extreme rather than kind of mainstream, right? So it's not letting go of who you are, but it's understanding that there is a cross between your personal self and your professional self, because you are not bringing your entire personal self into the workplace. You are bringing the professional you into the workplace, which is just as much an important part of you as the person who your friends get to meet. So let's break down different types of attire. When we say casual means what you wear at home or in your personal life. This might include things like jean shorts or jeans that do have holes in them. So when somebody says casual, we often think, oh, we can wear casual days, right? But that doesn't mean that you can wear the actual clothes that you wear casually in your everyday life. Instead, usually when we say casual attire, what we're referring to is smart casual. Smart casual conveys our personal style, but it adheres to professional standards, such as the clothing cuts, lengths of the clothing, parts of the clothing, that are what's being revealed with the clothing, etc. So when you have a casual day at work, what you really should be wearing is smart casual, not traditional casual that you would wear at home or in your personal life. You can take pieces of what you would wear in your personal life, but you need to make sure that those specific pieces adhere to professional standards of attire. Business casual is the most common that we're referring to. These are things such as pencil skirts, blouses, button-down shirts, trousers, khakis, blazers, and sweaters. We also can accessorize these types of attire with simple jewelry and belts. Shoes can include flats, loafers, mules, boots, or heels. And for our profession, I would argue that in some settings, shoes can include tennis shoes or something that is closed-toed and a little bit more comfortable for safety reasons, because sometimes we need to not be wearing heels. And business professional, that is what we think of when we think of someone wearing a suit and a tie and cufflinks. It is the traditional conservative business wear. And there's one more, business formal. So this is akin to evening wear. So if your agency was hosting a fundraiser that was taking place at a fancy restaurant downtown, you wouldn't show up in business casual for that, right? You would show up in something that was maybe darker colors, a knee-length dress or a long dress. So this can be akin to kind of an evening wear. Maybe a male might wear a tuxedo. This would be business formal. And so you dress based on the type of setting that you are in. Some of you might have a business formal event that you have to attend for your practicum, but in general, we're going to be somewhere between business casual and smart casual. The other thing I want to take note of is that there is, these are not gender specific in terms of what is professional to wear. There's gender neutral professional attire. And so we don't have to say, oh, a woman has to wear an evening dress or a man has to wear a tuxedo, right? People can wear things that are gender neutral and do not and should not be forced into wearing a specific type of attire based on gender norms. All right, so now we have made it to our final type of communication, which is written communication. Written communication includes emails, text messages, reports, clinical notes, and documentation that we use in a professional workplace. Now, in written communication, we are still a receiver and a sender, but now the response is being translated into written communication. So we're still receiving information, whether we receive it verbally or via somebody else's writing. We also then still have our intrapersonal communication where we process that response. And then we move on to being a sender, meaning we write down a response. In this process, reading, the person who is sending a written message to us, replaces listening. Reading is fundamental, right? So in the same way that we have to practice good listening skills when we're receiving information in a verbal communication, we have to thoroughly read people's responses and communication when we receive written communication. I want to start with text messages, because text messages are a quick way to communicate small snippets of pertinent information. But there are some downsides to using text messages. One, it has no tone. And because we're only able to communicate small snippets of information, we might not be able to include certain caveats that are important to the message that we're sending. So let's say that we want to let somebody know an important, meeting that they need to attend. And we say, be at such and such at noon, but we haven't or don't have time to clearly explain to them why it's so important to be there. So you receive a message that says, be at such and such at noon, right? It comes off as cold and inconsiderate because they didn't ask you if you had anything else to do at noon, right? They didn't consider that you might be working on another project or have another meeting at the same time. So text messaging can be really informal and inconsiderate and not take into account. So for the important considerations that are needed when you're sending and receiving, right? So for those reasons, text message communication needs to have very clear boundaries, okay? So here are some tips for improving text message communication, because it can be helpful in professional settings if we use it the right way. The first thing is set expectations for what is appropriate to communicate via text. If you've already established a meeting and you're just communicating, hey, I'll see you at such and such time as a reminder to the person, totally okay to send via text message. If you're asking for somebody for a meeting time, sending a text message that says, hey, Dr. Nelson, I want to meet with you. I need to talk about my paper. Let me know. Not worthy of a text message, not an appropriate use of text message, right? There is too much back and forth that needs to happen that cannot happen via text. What time? What do you need to talk about? What class are you referring to? I might have you in multiple classes and I don't know which class you're talking about. So text messaging is not always going to be the most appropriate way. So you need to set expectations. When should I text? What can I text, right? Brevity. Text messages are meant to be short and sweet and to the point. They're not meant to look like emails. And we're going to talk in a moment about how we need to communicate differently when we are using an email than when we're using a text message. So text messages are brief. Somebody sends you a long text message, you tend to not read the entire thing, right? Because it's on your phone. So instead, you need to make sure that you're communicating in small snippets. That's the purpose of a text message. Tone is conveyed in a different way than with verbal communication. So in verbal communication, we use our voice and volume to communicate tone. In a text message, tone is communicated by case. That means using lowercase and uppercase, all caps, right? If you use all caps in a tone text message, I think you're screaming at me, right? Spelling is important. That is conveyed. If somebody's using the word you, Y-O-U, spelled as the letter U, that indicates to me that you're in a hurry, that you're on a very informal basis with me because you don't see the need to spell out the word. Punctuation, so use of periods, exclamation points, and use of emojis. All of that conveys a tone. And when we're talking about using text messages for professional communication, we don't want to be using the same tone with our supervisors, professors, that we use with our friends, which means your most popular used emojis should likely not be used in your text message communications with your in your professional settings. You also need to make sure that you are not using all caps in your text messages, that you're capitalizing the word I and not using a lowercase, that you're using appropriate forms of English, spelling words out and putting periods where they need to be. Here's the most important thing. Text message does not replace other forms of communication. So I gave an example earlier of someone reaching out and saying, hey, I need to meet with you. So let's say that I respond and say, okay, I'm available at noon. That needs to be followed up with an email or a meeting invite, right? Text messaging is not the final form of communication. It's used to communicate quickly, but it's not formal. So following up with written communication that is formal is almost always going to be appropriate. And the same thing can be said for verbal communication. I can say anything to you, but if it's not in writing, there's no accountability, right? So oftentimes we talk about following up with written communication to verbal communication. Text messaging is not that appropriate written communication. It is instead email. So let's talk a little bit about using professional communication in email. So I have here two examples, one that's not so good and one that is an excellent example of how to use written communication. In the first email on the left, the person has sent a message saying, I won't be able to make it to class tonight, my bad. Now we just talked about text message communication. And if you'll notice, this is an example of how things can come across when we don't use appropriate capitalization or case. The word I is not capitalized. Won't is missing the conjunction, so we don't have an apostrophe. there's a period, and then the my bad is just kind of thrown there at the end, like as if it's a salutation, right? This is often what our text message communication would look like. This wouldn't be appropriate communication for either a email or a text message for professional communication. Now, if you talk to your friends like this via text, no problem. Professionally though, this does not adhere to professional standards. So instead, how could we make this professional communication? Well, first things first, if you notice, in this copy of the right, on the right, there is an email subject line. So automatically the sender or the receiver of the written communication is immediately clued in to what the person is talking about. They're talking about Social Work 106, the research paper. Or let's say that you are communicating with your supervisor that you need to take a day off, right? Your email signature or your email subject line would say request for time off. They immediately know before they open the message and have prepared themselves to receive the communication that you are sending. So once they open the message, immediately I'm greeted with salutations, letting me know that this message is for me. I am the intended receiver. This student then says, I'm unsure how to cite a video reference for a paper that I'm working on for Social Work 106 class. That then lets me know, here's what they need. Here is the topic of this. They would like to set up an appointment to meet with me for additional guidance. And then they go on to say, due to my practicum schedule, I am only available to meet on Fridays outside of your normal office hours. So what is that telling me? If they had simply said, can you meet on Friday? My response would have been, no, my office hours are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, right? But because they gave me all of the information, the pertinent information I needed upfront, we don't have to do a lot of back and forth with the dialogue, right? There's not I got to write you back and say, please use my office hours. And then you write me back and say, I'm not available during your office hours because I'm at my practicum. And then I write you back and say, okay, fine, we can meet on Friday. That we can eliminate all of that if you give the information that's pertinent up front. This is different than verbal dialogue, okay? So if we were verbally discussing this, we might have that back and forth because it's quicker, right? But in written dialogue, you put everything out there up front. So you don't minimize things. It's not just, hey, I need to meet at this time. You need to propose times. You need to give an explanation of why you're meeting, okay? And then finally, thank you in advance for your consideration. And then if you notice down at the bottom, there is the student's name, their title, and ways to respond to them, right? So let's say that I say, oh, this email is warranting of a phone call. I can't respond. Maybe I need to say, hey, we have to find an alternate time to meet, or I'm available, I need to talk to them right away. I can reach them. Or let's say that, it's now Friday. I know that we're supposed to meet at noon, but I don't have this student's number at hand. Well, now I have to go dig through something and look for their phone number in all of these databases that we have with all the students' information. And instead, they could have just put it right on their email for me to contact, right? So non-verbally, what that conveys to me is that they're considerate and they're saying, I know I'm asking for a call. Let me put away on my email for them to be able to get in touch with me. These little nonverbal cues convey to us things all the time about the person's caring and consideration and their investment in this, right? If you ask me to meet, but I have no way of contacting you, it would come across as you not being invested in the actual meeting, right? Because you didn't think it through all the way, or the student didn't think it through all the way. This is why all three aspects of communication are so important. All right, so when we are doing professional communication written, we need to include all of the pertinent information. We need to be succinct, right? So that sentence before, the student didn't say, I have practicum on Fridays from such and such. They didn't include irrelevant information, but they included all of the relevant information. Using appropriate formatting is especially important for showing respect. So greeting people, using appropriate salutations, Miss, Mr., Doctor, or if you don't know the person's gender, not using a salutation at all, or I'm sorry, not using addressing them at all in that way, using their full name instead, right? Not assuming that you can call a person by their first name. Knowing when to start a new paragraph, right? So it's not just a bunch of words jumbled together, but that in the same way when we communicate verbally, we take pauses, let people respond, that you do the same thing when you're writing. Avoiding using slang or writing like we speak. So oftentimes, one of the things that we can get hung up on is using long sentences, because when we speak, we use long sentences. We connect things with words, because, and, also, in addition, and it's almost like one long sentence, but we don't do that when we write. The other thing is verb and noun agreement. Sometimes, even in professional settings, we use slang terms like, he ain't gonna go anywhere, or he ain't gonna do it. We would never speak that way in writing. And so make sure that the way you talk is not the way you write. Finally, when we're emailing or using written communication, the message is conveyed with words only. Therefore, tone can be more difficult to read. And it's all the more important that we are making sure that we use an appropriate tone. That might be reading the email back to yourself out loud to make sure that your tone comes across appropriately. That's also using things like not using 5 exclamation points at the end of it, because that level of excitement is not appropriate for a professional setting, right? Not using 12 question marks as if you're, asking someone like, what? Like, oh my gosh, you don't want to use excessive exasperation in your written communication. All right, so finally, what we're going to do here is just kind of recap everything that's been done so far and talk about how do we improve personal and professional communication in professional settings. So here are some considerations. 1, gossip. Okay, so our personal and professional communication also relates to what we're saying, how we're saying it, and the content. So gossip can be things like complaining about your workplace to people who are not the appropriate person to be complaining to. So what might seem like I'm expressing to my colleague that I'm frustrated with a certain situation that's happening is actually going to, from a nonverbal stance, come across as gossip. There are appropriate people who you communicate certain things to, and you all have to be able to discern when it's appropriate to communicate with certain people about what. So, talking about someone who's consistently late, maybe that's an intrapersonal communication that you think to yourself and say, gosh, my supervisor is constantly late. It shows that they do not have consideration for my time, right? So maybe they're not personally communicating well. It is not an appropriate response to then go to somebody else and verbally communicate your frustration with them if they are not someone who is in the line of who you should be talking about that with. Who should you talk about that with? Your practicum placement folks. So for MSW folks, that would be Miss Dennis and Miss Mumfield, that you go and talk to and process that with. Going to your colleague and discussing it with them, going to another employee and discussing with them would not be appropriate. Also, it's important to discuss, to respect roles and boundaries, right? So even though you might have a colleague that is also your friend, outside of work, you guys communicate one way, but when you are inside of work, you communicate another way. You wouldn't be sitting talking about issues that you're having with your partner while you were while you are at your practicum setting, even if you normally talk to that person about issues that you have with your partner. That type of conversation should be saved for outside of the work setting. Similarly, the way you talk with them. Let's say that you normally talk with them using a vernacular that is very lax and you use a lot of slang. You would not do that when you are speaking with that same person at the work setting. Even if you and that person live together and you're roommates, the way you talk to them at home is not the same way you're going to talk to them at work. And why is that? Because we are always communicating. And even when we think we're having interpersonal communication, that's one-on-one with another person, there are people who are observing our behaviors. They're observing how we interact with others. And if they don't have context and know, well, that's their roommate or that's their best friend, right? All they see is unprofessional communication. They don't have the context to know, oh, well, they're communicating as friends, because they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be communicating as colleagues at that time. People are also always observing things like promptness. Are you coming back from lunch on time? Are you taking a lot of days off, right? Is there always a reason? Yes, maybe you are communicating effectively that you're missing work, but maybe you're just always missing work. There's always some reason. That's communicating something, right? It's communicating how important this practicum is to you. So remember, we're always communicating. Also, be aware of your intrapersonal communication, so your internal dialogue. So again, our facial expressions tend to match what we're thinking. And sometimes we need to check our thoughts. So when we're hearing someone say something, we can respond in an exasperated manner because we have our own internal dialogue that's happening. And then we end up sending messages that we didn't intend to send. Or maybe we had that dialogue, but we didn't intend for it to be conveyed. So remember, sometimes with interpersonal communication, you choose whether or not you want to convey what you're thinking in your head. Be aware of that. Be aware of what you're thinking, and do I want to convey this? So if somebody is getting on your nerves or you're frustrated with someone, do you really want to communicate that to them at this time? Is it an appropriate time or setting to communicate your frustration with them? And if your body language changes, then yes, you are communicating with that with them. There might be some times where somebody does something in your professional career and it is not the appropriate time to address it. Or maybe it's not appropriate to address it with them, right? So somebody is maybe not respectful of your time, they're late for a meeting, or somebody schedules a meeting without consulting with you. Somebody steps on your toes and sees your client without letting you know, right? Or you hear somebody's gossiping about you in some way, right? It is not always going to be the appropriate time to address that. You need to figure out when is the appropriate time to address that and address it at that time. I'm not saying smile through it in the interim, but what I am saying is make sure that your body language does not convey the level of frustration if you feel like you need to first process what has just happened. The second thing is timing your responses. So responding to emails within 24 hours, but also not responding in a rushed way. Remember all those things that have to be considered when you're responding with written communication. It needs to be well thought out, making sure you're including all that pertinent information and that you're being succinct. And that cannot be done quickly. You have to stop and process it. You also need to make sure that when you're responding, you have done your due diligence to receive the messages that were sent before, so that you're not immediately responding to an email that you have not read in its entirety. A majority of the time, that's an issue that we run into, that people have responded to an email, but they never got to the end of it. So they did not see crucial information that would have changed the way they responded. Final thing is be consistent across communication types and settings. So written communication should be used as a follow-up to verbal communication whenever possible. And you should be saying the same thing in the email that you said in the discussion or the meeting, right? Also, settings. We are in an era where we work in different types of settings. Sometimes we might be doing telework, right? We might be phoning in for a meeting. We might be, presenting via Zoom, and it requires the same use of verbal, nonverbal, and written communication. So if you are phoning somebody and you have a video discussion with them, but you're out on a walk on your phone, walking around, the setting is kind of changing, there's background noise, it limits our ability to send and receive messages. You're not going to be as an effective listener, and you're not going to be effective speaker. And so you need to use those same skills that we've already discussed, whether you are working telework, in person, by phone, etc. So The objectives that we had today for personal communication, dress, attendance, and punctuality should have been met. Students should now be able to understand the basics and importance of effective communication, including verbal, nonverbal, and written communication. We discussed those in depth. Understanding the use and importance of body language and voice tone in effective communication. We discussed the impact of it and various ways to improve it. Understand the importance of attendance and punctuality in the workplace and practicum. We discussed how attendance and punctuality is a form of nonverbal communication that conveys to our employers and our practicum supervisors how we feel or think about certain situations about our practicum placement, and understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate professional attire. We also discussed how this is also a form of nonverbal communication. So I thank you for listening, and I wish you guys the best experiences at your practicum sites.